Hello, and welcome to this next Relearn event from wherever you are. We are trying something a little bit different tonight. It's tonight for Sydney, today in Europe, and very early morning in America. We're running two sessions, and we have done some pre-recording of a couple of the talks in order to be able to do that, because we wanted to make this conversation truly a global event. So it's fantastic to have Luca Parry with us today as our live guest. Luca is in Adelaide, so that's about 1,500 kilometres away from where I am in Sydney, and it's nighttime for both of us. I know that it's just past midday in Central Europe, and that there are people in India, and that there are people from all around the world who have joined into the dialogue now. An incredibly important one. The issue of well-being and schooling has been around for a couple of decades, and for those who've been intensely involved with, student pastoral matters in schools over the last decade, we've seen a rise in the number of issues to do with mental health and anxiety, and I guess the pandemic has brought us to a point where we're very, very conscious that we can no longer sit back as educators, as leaders, and just leave it to chance to sort of work itself out. So today's conversation is about that, and it's fantastic to have Luca here. I'm going to pass over to him. We've organised for Luca to speak in two different spots tonight. We're also joined by Sol Espoil. Sol is going to be on both sessions. She's here with us for this first session, and also in the second session coming up. So Luca, thank you so much for joining the conversation today, and we look forward to your wisdom. And it's been fantastic collaborating over Zoom to get to this point.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here with you all. To talk about something that is very close to my heart, which is well-being. And hopefully over the next 10 minutes, which is the first kind of introduction of a few of the concepts that I'll speak to, it'll also have a bit of a global understanding of why really this potentially is the moment for us to remake and reimagine what learning can be for young people, but also for all of us. Be we educators, leaders, people working outside the education ecosystem, really at all different parts. As Stephen said, here is the wonderful country of Australia. It is my home. I'm in that big purple state called South Australia right now. And as I went through school, this was what I recognized as Australia, our states and territories. And it really only took for me to be about 18 years old when I saw for the first time this map. Now this map is also Australia, but it looks quite different because this map is a map of all of the First Nations countries that exist within Australia, an enormous diversity, as you can all see there. And so I want to begin before moving on by using a beautiful protocol that we have here in Australia. It's called an acknowledgement of country, because right now I am in southern Adelaide, which is a city, but I'm also on Kaurna country. And so I'd like to attempt Kaurna, which is the local language here. Ngadlu tampenti yalaka ngadlu Kaurna yatanka iparenti, ngadlu tampenti panaku tuila yatanka. And that's an acknowledgement of country in Kaurna, which just means I acknowledge the country that I'm on right now has been inhabited for tens of thousands of years here in Australia. And there's an enormous wisdom that comes from stopping and listening to the country, but also to Indigenous peoples all over the world. Crises disrupt, clearly, but they also reveal. And right now, I don't know about how you feel, but certainly there is this impending doom, this increased global anxiety about COVID-19 and what it actually means. And so before we do anything else, I just want you to stop for a moment, even if you're kind of walking, wherever you happen to be on our planet, and just take a deep breath in for 5 seconds. And release for 5 seconds. It's amazing with everything that's happening right now, how how stuck we can get into our heads and how it's really important, not least of all because we're facing a respiratory virus, but that we use our breath to be able to engage some of the powerful mindfulness and also well-being mechanisms that it enables us. Here's where I want to start. I want to zoom out to the highest level possible. And this, as you would well see, is a video. And it's the world GDP by country in billions of US dollars. And so what we're seeing here is economic growth. Now, GDP stands for gross domestic product. And you can see here, since 1967, which is where this particular visual starts, the world has experienced really significant economic growth. Now, by and large, that's been a very positive thing for most of the world. We have fewer people living in extreme poverty than ever before, for example. We have many countries that have been able to develop a significant middle class, that have seen entire communities lifted out of poverty. However, it's also created an enormous amount of issues as well as a byproduct of economic growth. And so one of the theses that I have that I want to pose to all of us today is, does this model still serve us? Does counting what we do and success as just growth in its kind of bluntest form in terms of GDP, is that what we want to continue to do? So when we think about the way that the world has been shifting over the last, couple of decades, with the rise of exponential technologies, with the computational era, we have seen a really significant disruption in the job landscape. We have seen a significant change. You can see the emerging roles here from some research by the World Economic Forum, the Future of Jobs report. We can see there are declining roles and there are also emerging roles. And so we are seeing really significant macro disruptions into what employment is. So those are the roles. What about the skills that underpin them? The skills that we focus on as educators through our work, but also that policymakers focus on in terms of trying to set up societies to be successful. Well, you can see the growing skills and the declining skills. Anything that is routine, be it manual or cognitive, is actually being automated by the converging technologies and the drive of the law of accelerating returns in particular. So you can the idea of analytical thinking, active learning, creativity, critical thinking analysis, complex problem solving, emotional intelligence. These are, we know, the growing skills that from the economic standpoint of jobs, employers are actually asking for. And these are the growth areas. Here's the problem from down under here in Australia, for those of you overseas, is that even in our country, it's incredibly difficult to get into full-time employment. So at 25 years old, here in Australia, even though 2/3 of 25-year-olds hold a post-school qualification, either an apprenticeship or a university degree, 50% are not working full-time. And of course, that's only going to become more the case with the impending economic challenges that all of us are going to face globally. So that's just the economic paradigm. This graph, I think, is as important, if not more important, because the World Health Organization, which of course all of us now know about because of the global crisis, they have been showing that really, they've been predicting that the global burden of disease, the largest global burden, will actually be depression by 2030. Now, one of the concerns that I have is that because of physical distancing or social distancing, and because of the economic disruptions, we might actually get to that earlier, as we see this incredible rise in mental health and substance abuse disorders, as you can see here on this particular graph. And sadly, Australia is overrepresented in terms of the globe in that as well. So where to from here? Well, this is, I think, one of the most interesting things about the emerging economic theories that we see around the world. In my view, the old growth model is no longer fit for purpose. It's not just my view. I'm far more qualified people like Kate Raworth, who wrote a great book called Donut Economics. We need to rethink what success is for a society. And so it's not just about growth. It's about how do we create, thriving or flourishing or well-being or wellness through every single part of our system design as societies and as education systems. So for example, this means not just measuring some of the things that are easy to measure and valuing them, but actually trying to measure the things that we value most. This is a wonderful model because it looks at overshoot and shortfall. It really tries to pick up the equity question that we have, but also the fact that we can't overshoot and that growth for the sake of growth will actually end up destroying the world at the same time. You can see climate change, air pollution, land conversion, freshwater biodiversity. There are a significant range of equal ceilings we are overshooting. So this is, I think, really important, to think about the biggest picture possible, because for our work in schools and in education systems, we need to think about what does success actually mean? What is a school for? What is a government for? What is a society for? These are the big questions we're seeing being asked all over the world. So the last thing I want to just talk about at this really high level, before we kind of look at, what are the interesting educational models that are emerging globally, is some, I think, really interesting policy work. Now, I'm a practitioner. I'm a school teacher by training. I was a school leader for a while. So policy for me, wasn't always the thing that excited me the most. But if I'm excited about any policy making right now, it is this idea of what would it look like if we had a frame for policy that focused on well-being and not on growth, not on GDP. Because even though we've got increasing GDP and we've had it for decades, we have more mental health crises, we have increasing inequality, we have all of these challenges. So how might we better focus on what success is for a country? And so I applaud the New Zealand government. And again, this is very new work, but you can see here, they are taking these particular issues and really trying to create a well society, not just a rich society in terms of GDP, but one which is well. And so how on earth would you know if your society is well? Well, we need to create new metrics and new measures. And this is the same for us in schools, which I'm sure we're going to cover quite a lot of this session, Stephen. But I wanted to start at this level. We need to change what success means, what we conceive success as. And that really is the most powerful thing we can do as leaders in societies, is to say, here's what success has been measured as. We don't think that's fit for purpose anymore. So we need a new standard, a new framework, a living standards framework, because it won't serve us if we have, enormous wealth inequality, or we have ecological collapse whilst we continue on our kind of growth obsession that we have. And I'll just leave you with, before I throw it back to you, Stephen, a wonderful provocation from Sir David Attenborough. And this is a bit unfair on economists, because I know some fantastic economists. But he says, anyone that thinks you can have infinite growth in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And so the question for us is, how might we change what success means for us as a global community, for us as a nation state, for us as a local community, for us as a learning community at a school, and ultimately for us as an individual as well, and really focus on all of those different levels for us in terms of what success, and clearly in my view, that emerging conceptualization of success is more and more about collective well-being than it is about any type of competitive or traditional metric or measure that we've inherited from the past kind of conceptualization. So there's my starting point, Stephen. I hope that's okay to start at that level.
No, that was fantastic. I think we have to start at that level, because we have to get this global perspective on why we're at where we're at the moment, because then that flows all the way through. And I think that's a great question to be asking, first of all, to define success, because success as a term by itself suggests that someone wins and someone loses going through. And so that the definition and the redefinition of that is incredibly important. There is a Twitter feed, and you can send some live questions through to that. It's relearn, #relearn2020, and that will be being checked for me and during the live event, and then we can hopefully answer some questions that get sent through that during that time. Now, Luke is going to come back in a little while and share a way forward. So after having presented that big picture, But during the last week, I've had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Helen Griffith. Now, Dr. Helen Griffith is in San Diego, an amazing educator, and she will be live in the second section. It's still nighttime in San Diego now. So we're going to switch across to that particular interview and enjoy some wisdom from Dr. Helen Griffith. Well, I'm here today with Dr. Helen Griffith. I'm in Sydney, and Dr. Griffith is in San Diego. We met almost a decade ago, I think, and during and had lots of interesting conversations during that time. And it's a delight to be able to talk with you, Dr. Griffith, again on this occasion, especially when we're looking at the incredibly important issue of wellness and mental health going through. And we can say hello because we know that we're all in different time zones, and people who will be tuning into this will be coming in from all around the world as well. So welcome and hello.
Hello, Stephen. It is always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. You've been an amazing thought partner over the years and taking education where it needs to go. So it's good to be here with you today on Zoom.
Excellent. Yes. Now, the conversation today, we're talking about wellness and learning, and we're putting both of those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. So why should we do that? Why should communities, whether they're teachers, parents, policymakers, why should these two components be placed together?
Well, you said it well, Stephen. The jigsaw puzzle, and we know in a puzzle, if a piece is missing, the puzzle is not complete, and the puzzle is not beautiful. And the puzzle doesn't do what it's designed to do. It's designed to make beauty and, of course, to be one whole package. And so mental health, wellness, and learning must be placed together because they're integral parts, and they're synonymous, and they must synergetic, rather. They must work together in order to create that 360 approach for learners. As we develop our schools, as we develop pedagogy and curriculum, that's got to be a central part because it is an essential piece. And without it, our schools aren't complete.
And okay, I know it's a passion piece for you. Why is this a bit of a passion piece for you?
Well, over the years in education, we've seen a trend that when scholars aren't doing well, we don't particularly unpack all of the reasons why. We typically in education would look at the academic piece. We might even look at doing a special education plan to see if there were some physical disabilities. But we don't necessarily focus on wellness. And if there's trauma in a child's life, if there's some insecurities such as food insecurities or housing insecurities or emotional insecurities because of the environment that they're coming from, we don't address that as an essential piece of understanding why they're not being productive and successful academically. And that now that we're seeing these trends and we're starting to infuse wellness into the schools, we're actually seeing the data showing us making a difference, that kids can be successful, they can become advocates for themselves and for others as we address their trauma, as we address the wellness piece. That's so essential.
Okay, so look, I mean, this is a dialogue that is really important anyway. We know that mental health is an ongoing issue, and that probably in the last 10 years as a school leader, I've seen it accelerate as an issue to alarming levels. But we're choosing to have this dialogue now in the context of a pandemic. Do you see any special reason to be talking about it right now?
Well, it's been elevated, absolutely. I don't know if around the world that 2020 was, in America, it was deemed the year of clear vision. It was kind of the catchphrase. And in this pandemic, we have really seen clearly some of the challenges that we're facing more so in education now than ever. So in a pandemic, it's been highlighted, it's been elevated to another level of importance. And I think more people are seeing it now as ever before. As our scholars are now sheltering in place, void of physical contact with not only their peers, but their teachers, their faculty, the support staff, the needs become greater. Some of them are in homes where they've had challenges and where they've experienced trauma, and their parents are experiencing even more trauma with all of the uncertainties with the pandemic, not only around health, but around the economy, around job security and shelter. So now it's become a heightened reason for us to address it because of the pandemic. And the year 2020 has just made that very clear for us. And so we should step in, we should push in.
Yes, it's one of those funny ironies of life, that 2020 vision. That we've always thought about that, and we never had any knowledge that this was all about to happen. Now, you used the phrase beforehand about a 360-degree approach to educating a whole child. But what do you actually mean by that?
Well, literally 360 means a full circle. So that means we must address all of the issues and concerns that concern our scholars. So schools now, or at least my schools, we're facing, of course, the academic challenge of making sure that they have their academic needs met. Food insecurity, some of them come to us hungry. And so not only do we have to provide lunch and breakfast at school, but we have to address the hunger of the family. The other emotional insecurities that we're finding, they're barriers to learning, they're barriers to successful behaviors, and we have to address those as well. So we have to really wrap our arms around the entire child, and we have to have a multifaceted approach so that we can, of course, create these amazing global citizens that will be able to go out from our schools and create that same opportunity in whatever arena they find themselves.
Okay, now I suspect that because of your empathy and compassion for people, this has always been something in your head, but do you see the lack of that 360-degree approach as having been a problem up until now, or is it an ongoing problem in other educational jurisdictions?
Well, the cog moves very slowly in large districts. You know, we've all been a part of large districts, and at least here in the United States, that was one of the reasons charter schools were formulated, so that they could be adaptable, flexible, turn on a dime. I'm sure many of the private schools are able to do the same. They are getting the message, but the ship is moving rather slowly, and the elephant is taking baby steps. Because it's a big challenge, it does require a significant amount of financial resources. We have to be creative in the way that we fund these opportunities, but nevertheless, we must be diligent and serious about making it happen because it is a pressing need. And I'm hoping the districts will look at some of the models that are there, and leadership for our district will join forces and understand that's something that we're just gonna have to press into and really make a difference. But you're right, Stephen, it is a slow process, but I do believe we're all seeing the advantages. It's just, how do we make it happen? Keeping the conversation alive and forceful, and, you know, being very, very deliberate about those conversations and not being silent.
Okay, so for some people, though, around the world, it's a new conversation and it's not been part of it. How might an educator or a community know that they've got to infuse thinking about wellness, well-being, mental health into their programs? What are the symptoms of when it's not there?
Well, I think the first thing is to look at data. And any good school should be really collecting a diverse amount of data, varying degrees, perceptions data, as well as academic data, your systems data, and to see what is it saying to you. Survey your scholars and see what they're feeling. Look at the data around when they come to the, maybe when they're referred to the nurse's office or the health office, or when they're being referred to counseling, or what teachers are saying about what's the behaviors that are going on in the classroom. The PBIS, the Positive Behavioral Intervention Support System, that I know is one of the systems we use here in the United States, it talks a lot about data collection, and really looking at trends about what's going on. Then we need to let the data speak to us. And when scholars present themselves to us, then we need to begin to pull the layers back and understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving, or why they're having some of the difficulties, and ask those types of questions. So really, leaders who haven't engaged in those conversations, I would recommend they start looking at the data. They start doing data collection, specifically around what the trends that they're seeing, and then let the trends begin to speak to them. And then start to talk to other leaders and find out, so what are the possibilities of what we can create to mitigate some of the issues?
Okay, so then if we're thinking about the data and we're bringing it down to the level of the student, to the child, I know that from my experience, it wasn't hard to identify that you might have had someone that was struggling with an issue in their final years of schooling that was way bigger than fear of exams, or way bigger than fear of assessment, and you had to have an intervention. You had to actually remove them out of a system, whatever else, just so that they could survive almost. But what do you see as a child potentially bringing to the table of their own learning that that's critical? And what does that mean for the community and for the teachers that actually interact with them? What should, in a practical sense, how should a teacher respond? How should a school respond to what a child has brought to the table?
That's a very, very, very good point, Stephen. Number one, they bring their voice to the table, and we must listen to them. And when they bring their voice to the table, we must then empower them to continue to use that voice. For example, we had a scholar at one of my former schools in the 12th grade. She wrote her college essay, because we were a college prep program. She's writing her essay to get into college. She shared an experience, this is an English class, in her essay about being raped by her brother-in-law. So the teacher read the essay. Because we have the culture of understanding and listening to students and they're, giving them agency and voice, she then brought it to the counseling team and brought it to the instructional support team. She brought the essay forward. We checked the essay out. Then we had a mental health clinician, fortunately on site, who brought her in for further investigation. We talked with her and found out that this was in fact true. It was still going on. Of course, we had to bring in the authorities, to bring in the parents, because it did become a legal matter. But we were able to get her the care that she needed in terms of the therapy to get her through that senior year. And not only that, but to address the trauma in the family, because it was actually happening with many of her sisters, and they had never spoken about it. So it's very, very important that when they give voice to a concern, and we must address it immediately, and we must address it at every level. And so we brought the team around her. She was able to, of course, finish that year, to continue in therapy, and to become, to gain that wellness that she needed to become a whole individual and a whole young lady. So there were community resources that we had to bring into play. When the scholar brings that voice to the table, we brought in, of course, the legal authorities. We had to bring in other voices from the community in terms of therapy for her sisters who were not a part of our school, and then therapy and support for the parents as well. So it is a village approach. But the first thing that is critical is the voice that they bring to the table. And sometimes it may not be as deliberate as you hear it in an essay, but they may make some type of indication in a classroom, in a discussion, and listen to them and then investigate. Don't bypass, don't minimize what you've heard and think, oh, I'm not. Investigate, especially if your eyebrow goes up in the least. But we've actually built into the DNA, Stephen, a culture where we address those things and it becomes the way that we do business. And schools must consider that as well as we move forward in addressing wellness and learning together. Okay,
now I am particularly interested to talk with you about some of those things that you've brought into the process of leading a school. And I know that the whole concept of bringing health clinicians into the environment has been an opportunity and a strategy for you as well. I'd love for you to talk about, okay, what have you done and what does it look like, so that people can actually get their heads around that one.
Right. Well, initially we were a new school and we did not have reserves. We're a new public charter school. We didn't have reserves, of course, financial reserves. We were on a shoestring budget, just building the school, getting funding after the fact, and, having to really go for grants and loans before. So we came up with a partnership, and that's where that community comes in with the university, a local university in San Diego. They were preparing at the graduate level mental health clinicians, and they have to do hours of certification before they can test to receive their certification. So in these hours that they do, their clinical hours, they're supervised by a licensed clinician. And we developed a partnership with another clinician, Nicholas Boyd, as a matter of fact, was his name. And he helped us design a project at our school where we could bring in the scholars, the students, the graduate students, to do their intern hours with us while they would be supervised by the clinician. And then they would learn the rigors of school mental health and wellness, which is not really what they were training for. They were training for private practice. They were training to go in these other institutions, residential facilities, but not in the school setting. So we talked with the professor there. It was actually the University of San Diego. We started the partnership where the interns would come in, and all we paid was their supervision. So we didn't have to pay their salary. So we could afford that. But it was in our plan, our financial plan, our long range planning, that we would build in enough financial capital to then fund these positions after they would then license, because I believe they had to do like 3,000 hours, so a lot of hours. So that gave us some time to build up the capital, to place it in our budget, and to be able to afford it, so that we could have the advantage and the opportunity of the experience and the expertise then while building it in. So after a few years, we got enough money, they licensed, and then we were able to hire them full time. And even while we were in the initial phases of the interns, we started a training process around building a culture of mental health and wellness and trauma-informed care and restorative practices. And the interns were leading this professional development. We were reading text with the staff, becoming experts in the area, and really building in that culture. And so now it looks like a program that you can actually replicate in other schools across the world with that model, because finances are key. You do need to fund the model, but you also need to create it as a part of the DNA, as a part of the culture, something that we do.
Yeah, no, it's as you've been talking there, I've been thinking, I mean, interestingly, in New Zealand, the government actually has two strategies happening at the moment. First of all, they linked wellbeing to government departments and said that government departments could only get a budget if they actually had a wellbeing statement. So you've actually had this focus on wellbeing across the whole country. But then more recently, with as they come out of the pandemic, the government has decided to place artists, creative people in schools in a residence program, so that recognising that the arts community has been hit very hard by the economic downturns created by the pandemic. So the idea of actually having a sculptor or a designer or a creator in residence is now going to be funded by the government into New Zealand schools. As you've just described your model, it's really placing the health clinician and residents right into the community, isn't it? Absolutely. So it's taking another twist. It's actually uniting both of those little agendas together to say this is critical. Why is it particularly critical for you in the communities that you've worked with?
Well, it's particularly critical because we are in areas of scholars that are below the poverty level. The school that I'm in now, they're actually not only below the poverty level, but they'll also be the first in their family to graduate from college. They're in neighborhoods where, typically in neighborhoods of color, mental health is a stigma, and to access mental health services is a stigma. But we know that we need to attend to our mental health because it is a part of of who we are, mind, soul, and body. So the communities that we're in have been stigmatized for pursuing mental health, and it's been unacceptable. And so now we see the tide turning, and we need to do it with this new generation, with this next generation, so that we can change the tide forever and make it acceptable and to make it, to normalize it. What we found, Stephen, even after 1 year in our program, the scholars were very hesitant to access the services. We actually had to really build the culture where our mental health clinicians were going into the classrooms, sitting, tutoring, having conversations, so they could understand that that was a regular person they were talking to and not the crazy doctor. I'm not going to see Dr. Crazy because I'm crazy. So we had to normalize and really shift the thinking and shift the mindset. And then in the second year, we actually found that scholars, not only did they start to self-refer, but they started to refer their peers. And they started to take them by the hand and say, come on, let's go see Mr. Jones, because we need to have a conversation. I'm concerned about you. And they actually started self-referring. And then we started our training on Saturdays where the parents would come in. We called it a parenting collaborative, but it was really kind of AKA a parenting class around helping your child around wellness, taught by our mental health clinicians. The parents started wanting to bring other parents that weren't even associated with our school. So we know there's a hunger, there's a need, and there's a model that we can create to make sure that our scholars, our families, our communities are transformed. And like I said, because of the needs of our community, it was even more of a 911. And I hope 911 around the world means an emergency. because it means an emergency here. That's the number you dial for the paramedic.
As we head towards the end of the conversation, just for now, for a school that has not had wellness as a pillar of their operation, what's a strategy or a tactic that you would recommend as a takeaway for them to consider? How do they bring a wellness agenda right into the heart of their operation?
Well, I do believe they've probably been doing the wellness work and not really counting the wellness work. Typically where you have counselors on board, they're doing the work. Typically teachers take off the teacher hat and they serve as counselors. So I would recommend that they look at where they're doing the wellness work, where it doesn't appear to be the wellness work officially, and that they begin to highlight that work. Again, going back to the data, what is our data saying to us that our scholars need? What are the needs that we're seeing so we can address them specifically? And then I think when they look at that they've been doing it already, that they see the need to do more of it, then they can build a case and they can build the conversations and they can start getting momentum and champions to help the cause.
Okay, now as we do conclude, I know that there's an opportunity for people to continue working with you in a series that is going to run in July, where you're happy to take people through a lot of the content that we've actually just talked about today and help people to create their own program for their school. I guess we are in a context where if people haven't had this front and center in their thinking, or if they know that the community doesn't understand why it's so important going through, that there is an opportunity to work with you over the next few weeks to get that right down to a grassroots level. So we really appreciate that opportunity that you've provided. If people wish to take it up, and they can follow the different links on the Learn Life page to find that as well. So we thank you for that. I could stay talking with you for hours, because my feeling is that the communities that you work in are so blessed to have, I guess, your insights about this topic, because it is the key to ultimately enabling a lifelong learner within the individual. It's all of these things have to come together in order for people to progress and to grow. So it's fascinating to hear. Anyway, look, thank you so much for joining in the conversation today.
Thank you, Stephen.
We've appreciated your insights, and the dialogue will continue.
Perfect. I look forward to it, and have a wonderful day, the rest of the day, way over there in Australia.
Global conversation with Helen, and we're looking forward to Helen being live in the second version of this event in a few hours' time. Luca, you actually haven't met Helen, I don't think, going through. Any key takeaways from that little presentation?
Well, a very insightful presentation, clearly. And, such is the modern world. Of course, we haven't met, but of course, we're kind of having this asynchronous conversation, which is just wonderful. Some really key things that I picked up in. I think some of the brilliant work that Helen is leading is the idea of an ecology. And so when we think about, a school is a dynamic living system. So the idea of bringing in, for example, university students or interns that have particular psychologies, for example, that like us don't necessarily have as part of our study. This makes sense because we're going with an ecological perspective. If we're going to have a 360-degree view of a student and place them at the center, there's no single person that can effectively give them everything that single person needs. Notwithstanding the wonderful roles that mentors, for example, can have. But really, ideally, you need the community involved. You need an integrated health model, which it sounds like is exactly what Helen has kind of put in place. And often I think about some of the incredibly hardworking teachers, and we need to salute hardworking teachers, not least of all at this particular moment with 1.6 billion learners disrupted in terms of learning. Teachers have been amazing at responding to that. But it's just too much of an ask to say, particularly if a student has had experienced significant abuse-related trauma, for example, we're not always best placed. We might be able to hold space, but also refer on to someone that can do that. And so the way that we structure schools, I think, is one of the aspects that we have at our disposal that we should really think carefully about. You know, when we look at mental health services, for example, that have been quite successful, often they have this integrated method. It's a one-stop shop kind of approach. And so similarly with a school, knowing that how interrelated learning and well-being truly are, I think having the idea of thinking of an ecosystem rather than kind of a delivery mechanism that we kind of said, no, sorry, we don't do that work, all the best. They're really being able to connect up so that the student or the human being in our hopefully human-centered design approach is actually getting what they need at that particular point in time.
All right, I've got a couple of questions I'm going to throw at you, but I'm going to wait till the Q&A at the very end. The big one would be, what would be the first thing you'd throw out of the school in order to then bring well-being right in, but we'll save that one for afterwards. So look, we want to move now to your second presentation where you can talk about moving forward, bringing well-being forward into the school context. So looking forward to that. Thank you.
All right, well, let's see how we go. And I think Helen has really framed this quite beautifully. And I think anyone that's listening along, hopefully will see a connection between the ideas. You know, a way forward. I really think there is something about design that we need to think about. You know, nothing really happens by accident, particularly when we're talking about policies, when we're talking about intentions, we're talking about metrics or measurements. We need to think like designers, as educationalists, as leaders. How do we create well-being by design? And in my view, it's really the future of leadership, is this idea of not being a task assigner, not even being a culture maker, but actually being a well-being designer so that people can thrive, because when they feel well, they do well. Why is that the case? Because we are multi-dimensional beings. I think it's Robert Frost that said, I am legion, I contain multitudes. All of us have multiple identities. We also have multiple aspects of that make us who we are. And so this is, I think, a really great way of thinking about well-being. It's the multi-dimensional well-being model. And so rather than saying, you know, a person is academic solely or social, you know, we are well when we have the convergence of our physical, social, mental, emotional, and spiritual health converging. And really, we can only thrive or flourish when all of those aspects are doing well. Of course, right now, and it's worth making this point, you know, I have a strong view that physical distancing is not the same as social distancing. I know that some fantastic epidemiologists would have come up with this term social distancing, but I just think it's super dangerous in some ways, right? Because we don't want to socially distance, we want to physically distance, but be as socially connected as possible. Not least of all, because it's one of the largest against stress and trauma and mental health, is how connected do we feel to the people around us right now? And that is the question we should be asking our students, our scholars. It's the question we should be asking our loved ones at home. How connected do you feel right now? And if the answer is not very, or I miss my friends, and you know, this is what young people are saying right now. As great as we are at delivering great learning, hopefully as teachers, you know, young people are saying they miss the social dynamic of a school. You know, really the beautiful dynamic environments. It's what make schools such wonderful places to be. I'm not sure, there's 3 T's, I've seen this kind of spoken about, but when we're responding to a pandemic, we really need to triage first, what's the most important thing to do, then transition, and then ultimately think about how we transform through that process. I mean, Stephen, I don't know about you, but if we are unable to reimagine success at this moment in time, concerned if we ever have to do so, because it really provides not just a crisis and not just really quite serious implications for us as societies. It provides potentially the biggest opportunity to throw out, to your point, some of the old systems that no longer serve us. Now, rush back to normal. Which parts do we not want to return to at all? So that's my rant about social distancing and physical distancing. But so what does that mean for us as schools and as systems? Well, I want to start at the big picture again. And this is the OECD Wellbeing Compass. And I love the metaphor of a compass. And Stephen, you and I have spoken about this, but the idea is, great, we can talk about the learning map. We can talk about where young people want to go and they can make their own journey. What if the map is constantly changing? And frankly, you know, who knew that 2020 was going to be like this? It feels like it's gone for 6 years, remarkably. So it really is the idea is, can you as an individual society have knowledge, the attitudes, the values and the skills, and to build out core foundations and transformational or transformative competencies that enable you to really, write your own story. And the piece I really like here is this idea of co-agency. It's not just saying to kids, go and do what you think, or let's do student voice. Yeah, what do you think about this? Well, we're still going to make the decisions because we're the adults. It's the idea of forming true partnerships and really paying attention to the prepositions that we use. Rather than doing school to kids or throwing learning at people, how do we do things not even for, but with? I think that's the deeper kind of question around co-design and co-agency that's emerging, knowing that at the end of this road is well-being for all. So the future of well-being, what is it? In my view, it's social, emotional, and academic. I don't think any of us would really be able to say that we haven't had too much of a focus on the academic outcomes. And that's just because it's easiest to measure. We can look at Bloom's taxonomy, we can look at a whole range of other things. It's easy to measure, just factual surface level knowledge. It's quite difficult to measure and therefore value things like compassion or empathy or, collaborative problem solving, which there has been some really interesting developmental progressions developed for. So I really think this idea of, paying attention to who we are as social and emotional beings alongside the cognitive is something that we should be having those conversations at the school level as often as we can. And I'm sure we can unpack that a bit more in the conversation. So if you haven't noticed by now, I just really like colorful circles placed on top of each other. It's Venn diagrams. I'm a huge fan of them. This is because they show in the simplest way possible how things interrelate and overlap. And here we've got knowledge, what we know and understand. We've got skills, how we use what we know, and we have character, how we behave and engage in the world. And then wrapped around that is this idea of meta-learning. This is called the 4-dimensional model. And it's created by a man called Charles Fidel from the Center for Curriculum Redesign, which is attached to Harvard. I just think this is a really good way to think about the work that we do. How do we support 21st century learners to develop their character, their skills, and their knowledge? Knowing that, mass education school systems really were developed for knowledge primarily and some skill. But of course, that's becoming more and more important to have this holistic 360-degree view. This is also something that we should pay attention to, because a framework or our strategic plans in our schools, they are what we pay attention to. That's really the role of them. And this is the CASTLE social emotional learning model. And they call these the Big Five. This is some wonderful work that's come out of the Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning in the United States, based in Chicago. And our colleagues there really have been doing this for 20 years. And so the idea here is, yes, we will be able to do things and to know things, but ultimately, what are the capabilities? What are the social and the emotional capabilities, constructs, terms that we want them also to be able to do? I would say a young person, any of us are successful if we have high levels of self-awareness, self-management, we can responsibly make decisions, and that we have relationship skills and social awareness. And I'll just bring your attention to the idea of those 3 outer circles. You look at the classroom as part of the ecology, and then you can look at the school as also part of the ecology. So classroom, curriculum and instruction, the intentional instruction, inquiry-based, project-based learning, whatever the case is. Where does social and emotional learning play a role? Where is it seen? How is it actually enabled? Then we've got school-wide practices and policies. And particularly if you're a school principal, you have some control over those, of course. And then ultimately, how do we connect to the community? Because if we're sending one people at school and we have this amazing piece, but the parents aren't on board with that message, we have a disconnect. And there's some remarkable examples where we have young people basically going home and talking to their parents about some of these skills, quite literally, educating their parents around some of the wonderful skills that matter, things like self-regulation. And at this particular moment in time, of course, having self-regulation and having to study virtually as someone completing school or someone in high school, that is just a crucial skill. How can you regulate both emotionally and cognitively to ensure that you stay on task and you can be productive, even though there's constant disruption and uncertainty? And again, I think teachers have just been remarkable at doing this all over the world in terms of just being able to show adaptability. I love Mary Helen Imaldino Yang. She's a neuroscientist from the University of Southern California, if I am not mistaken. And she says it's biologically impossible to learn something if you don't care about it at some level. So this whole idea of, you know, left brain, right brain, all these kinds of things, really the emotional centers and the cognitive centers are totally integrated in the neural architecture of our brains. So this whole like, be quiet and finish the task doesn't work. We need to be paying attention to how we feel. Because if we feel well, guess what? We think well. Now, the caveat I'd say about that is, actually, that's not always true. You know, if you're just doing a repeatable manual task, that's just the one thing. It kind of doesn't matter how you feel, but as soon as you introduce even some level of creativity or cognition, then all of a sudden, you do need to pay attention to how people feel. And similarly, if you think well, then you learn well. So the last kind of things I'd say, Stephen, is as people are interested in education, in really not just engaging young people, but empowering young people with a compass for them to navigate this constantly changing world, this map around us. A great question we should start with is, what is our graduate profile? You know, what could our young people that are leaving this educational ecosystem, this environment that we work so hard to create, to be safe and healthy and engaging, what could they know, what could they do, and who could they be? And we should have a clearly articulated, really, statement of, this is the graduate profile that we want. We want people to be, young people to be agents of change, or be able to be confident. And it's not just about, again, what they know and can do, but it's about who they are. And that's why this is some of my favorite work, the Values in Action work, that is, it comes out of the VIA Institute on Character, for example. And this is strongly related to positive education, which is a fantastic global movement that blends positive psychology and education. Similarly, if we can equip young people with language for them to talk about who they are as human beings, that is crucial in terms of well-being. Because if I judge myself, Stephen, by just what I know, and it turns out I don't know very much about one particular topic, well, then I will be in this cycle where I effectively rate my value based on that alone. But, you know, there's only one Luca Pari, as far as I'm aware, in the world. And, you know, so how do I enable myself to have a sense of value for who I am, not just what I do and what I know, and this sense of kind of doing and being. Okay, last bits. I really think part of this whole conversation, and I think Helen picked it up as well, is growth mindset, fantastic. Individual focus, right? We want a young person to believe they can be better and smarter and persevere and be gritty and all that stuff. But in my view, it doesn't go far enough. And we're seeing some really interesting work. Like, what is kind of the emerging success? We've seen it again with policy in New Zealand, seeing it from the OECD. It really is collective well-being. It's the idea of generous mindset. How do I realize that, Stephen, if it's not just you helping me, you know, it's actually that our destinies are intertwined as part of the same human species. So that seems a bit planetary, but that really, I think, is what we're all talking about here. Great. I'm a school leader. I'm going to school tomorrow. What can I use? Here's one of the best resources that's free that I found, that I often refer people to. It's called the Greater Good in Action website, and it's from the Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley, which is in California, in Berkeley, in the Bay Area. And they have some wonderful evidence-based kernels, practices that you can do with your staff, with yourself, and of course with your learners. And there's super practical, really, really key. A lot of them have a social and emotional learning base. Some of them have positive psychology, all the overlays. It's really wonderful. And this is what I want to leave everyone with, which is, in this world of the future, this digital world, the world of pandemics and uncertainty and adaptability and volatility, it's not just what we know. It's not just what we do with what you know. It's who we are, because we are human beings, not human doings. And our capacity to continue to learn across our lifetime really is the greatest gift that we can give any young person, because it's the greatest asset that they'll take forward from this particular point in time.
Okay, thank you so much. I do love that last comment, that we're human beings, not human doings. That says so much in so little. You also raised the whole issue about feeling well to be able to think well. And I guess that brings us on to the last part of our dialogue. And we have made another recorded interview. It'll be a live one in the second session. We've got Sol Espoil from the Learn Life team and Danish Karani from the Centre of America. And I met with them a few days ago, and we made a tape. They will both be live in the second session, and Sol will actually, she's with us right now as well, and will be with us during the question and answer process time after this next little video. So we'll watch that interview now. Well, we're here today with two really interesting people in terms of their job and their focus and their passions. Is Danish Karani, and Danish is located somewhere in the middle of America. And Sol Espoil, who is located at the moment in Learn Life in Barcelona. So thank you very much for joining the conversation. As people would be aware, that this is part of a series that we're running in two parts, and so this particular session has been pre-recorded in order to allow for the different time zones to be workable as we seek to create interest and an audience from around the world going through. So the topic for us today is about well-being and wellness, and then how that impacts the architecture and the interior design. Now, I know that both of you guys, this is sort of a passion topic. We might just start off with just hearing a little bit of that passion. I might throw it to Danish first, and then we'll go to Sol after that. So Danish, what got you into this space, this professional space?
Right. Well, thanks for having me, Stephen. It's, as an architect, you can choose to design and build anything you want, really. And so for me, it's always been about building things that I believe in. And so for me, it was architecture's a way to have agency in the world, how to sort of repair and perfect this imperfect world. And, I've always thought that education is the most proactive thing that we can do. So often as societies, we're very reactive to problems, and we're good at, going that route and addressing them after they happen. For me, education, I've always seen it as proactive because you can prevent people from creating problems in the world in the first place. And so designing for that just made a lot of sense as having widespread impact and preventing future problems. And so, and with education, of course, there's incredible reform efforts. There's brilliant people all over the world rethinking it. But I think what's often missed is the physical environment, right? In education, there's a lot of focus on curriculum and pedagogical changes, improving teacher quality and teacher training, technology in the classroom. And I always say, these are like ingredients. If you're trying to cook some incredible meal, you've got all these ingredients, but what are you going to cook them in? They have to come together in a pot, right? And so for me, architecture is that pot. It's that physical space where you're going to mix all these amazing things together. And without that pot, you can't cook that meal. And so, it's often forgotten. It's sort of always on the end of the list. Everyone's sort of back burner. So I was, I thought, okay, well, let's try to support these educators, because without that pot, they really can't cook this beautiful meal we're going to call education.
Okay, I guess a lot of that, Sol, will resonate with you, because I know that architecture and that design is your passion. Perhaps you could share with us, how did you come into this space?
I think there are two things. One is, like, when I think about when I was a small child, I always like to play with dolls, but not dolls, just to create the building and the environment to play with the dolls. So I always remember it takes me 5 hours to create that, and then I just forgot about the dolls. So I think that I live with this perception of how nice it is to create and transform all the environment that we live around. And then when I go through the university and finish my degree on that, I realized that I wanted to combine somehow kids, children, the learning environment and architecture, and how that could be all together. And yeah, somehow I start researching about the combination of architecture and kids and the learning spaces, and one thing goes to the other. I create ArchiKids, and then suddenly the dots come together, and we start with this genuine project that is learning the hub in Barcelona. So yeah.
Okay, so it's interesting when we talk about architecture in schools and education, because I guess part of our focus today is on the notion of well-being and how that influences or can impact the design of a space and the design of a school. In some ways, well-being has been a perspective or an additional topic that schools sort of tack onto the curriculum, knowing that they have to talk about well-being, and it becomes this fairly vague cloud of an idea that we have to focus on. But for both of you, well-being and wellness is at the core of your thinking as you attack the design process. I might throw it back to Sol. Sol, why is well-being and wellness such a critical component of designing spaces for learning in your mind?
I think that if I think about when I was at school and I was sitting, in a really uncomfortable chair, hearing to a boring lesson about Irish history, and imagine that I'm living more than 14,000 kilometers from Ireland. And now I think, and I said, this was just a missed opportunity in the terms that my school was an amazing castle constructed in the middle of a huge city. And imagine if we could use that space as a learning experience instead of just giving a lesson. So for me, the space is like what we said, the third teacher. We can just take so much advance using the space as part of a learning experience. So when we start with this project in Barcelona, my challenge was to convert every small corner of the building in a learning experience where the learners could feel completely motivated and just think out of the box, and where they could just feel this is home and a friendly and nice environment.
Okay, so Danish, for you, the connection between well-being and design and your thinking, how do you put those together? And for you, would there be an example where you've actually done something that you think, okay, that really has worked well?
Well, I think for me, it's stepping back and realizing that education is just a means to an end, and we rarely question what that end is. I think so much of education around the world is set up to funnel kids, from K-12 to higher education, and then from there into a job, right? And sort of landing this high-paying, prestigious job seems like the end, but it's really not. We know this from decades of research that that is not the end target that education should be pointed at, right? This sense of self-actualization, if you want to use Maslow, or if you want to use Japanese concepts of like ikigai, right? This idea that you have a purposeful and meaningful life, or even my colleagues at Harvard have done the longest longitudinal study in history on happiness, and they figured out that You know, it's about relationships, and so you could think of it as, you know, is our end goal happiness? Is it the quality of life? Is it our relationships? What, you know, what is it? And so for me, it's always stepping back and pausing to remind myself, okay, our goal here is not to just educate people so they can go become corporate cogs somewhere, or you know, just make a lot of money, but what is it really? And so if we want a better society, if we want you know, if we want better people, you know, are we educating them to really be that? And so it's, maybe we want to raise better citizens, right? Maybe citizens with a global mindset. Maybe we want to raise kids that are going to be happy, do good in the world, right? And so again, I think every project is an opportunity to think about that question again and figure out, are we designing for the right target? It's very easy to design a school that's going to get kids into university, and then from there, you know, design a university that's going to get them into a good job. That's easy. But at the end of the day, why did we waste all that energy? Because these young adults may not even be happy with their careers and lives if they don't have that sense of fulfillment or happiness. So, you know, one example, a couple of years ago, I designed a school just outside of the city of Chennai in India. And it's called the Riverbend School. And so the entire focus for the school, the school leaders, who oddly enough, none of them were educators, they were entrepreneurs, they had come from different backgrounds. And so they felt that sense of freedom of, you know, we can blow this model up and make it whatever we want. They didn't have that sort of inertia from years past. And so, you know, they said, really, what do schools typically focus on? Well, it's content, and then skills, and then character and well-being. And they said, well, let's flip that. Content these days, you could easily get online. And, you know, there have been models that have proven that, flipped classroom even, like it's very easy to get that anywhere and get it at home. Skills are obviously important, 21st century skills. But the most important in their mind was character and happiness and well-being. And so, you know, we've designed this, it's a boarding school campus, but it's a weekday boarding school because they also see great value in the kids learning from their parents and being around the family. And so on the weekends, the kids get shuttled back to Chennai. So this is about an hour and a half outside of the city. So they go home on the weekends. And so, you know, that design really was influenced by the study that I mentioned at Harvard, where it was, okay, if you want to create happy people, happiness is not predicated by your level of fame, the amount of money you have, you know, your job. And we can see this. I mean, this is obvious. You look at, you know, for example, I'm sure if you did a study of, you know, how happy celebrities are versus, you know, your average person, I doubt that you're going to see some sort of incredible spike in their happiness versus any of us, right? And so, anyways, you know, so they found out after decades of tracking individuals, it was your personal relationship. So we knew that we had to design a campus where personal relationships could be born, could be built. And so we turned to anthropologists. There's this incredible research, which was later turned into a documentary called The Economics of Happiness. And so this anthropologist, Helena Norberg-Hodge, she goes to Ladakh in the sort of northeast corner of India, and was studying villages and just how relationships are actually tightest knit and best in villages. So, you know, from there, I kind of knew, okay, we want to create happiness. We need to design for relationships, which means this campus probably needs to feel like a village. And so, you know, I did research on villages and their urban planning over the years, and kind of, you know, there's always a central square, and just outside of that is where people work and people live and recreate outside of that. And there's farming to the outskirts. And so we basically imported that model into a, you know, a school campus and designed it the same way, down to the details of it feels organic. It doesn't feel sort of, you know, rigidly master planned. It feels like it's aggregated over time. There's these narrow winding routes. So efficiency was not a key concern, right? It wasn't how do we shuttle kids from, you know, classroom A to classroom B or to the cafeteria or back to their housing as soon as possible. It's, you know, really these winding routes that allow kids to have longer conversations with each other, with their mentors, to slow down, smell the roses, as we would say. And so I think that's been a really great example of how you can weave in and really design around wellness as a key, because again, at the end of the day, we could produce kids that know all the content in the world, but if they're not happy or they're not using that content to create good in the world, why did we go through that whole process?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if we now reflect on the fact that we're at this point in history with what's happened in 2020, where we have all of the buildings sitting empty for a while around the world, and we have to suddenly work out how do we move back into them. Now, depending on what part of the world you're in, it's going to be a very different experience, because I know that here in Australia and in New Zealand, the decision to not enforce social distancing in the schools has meant that, to a degree, the pendulum has just swung back to where it was, and it's been picked up at that point. But I've also seen some pretty horrific photographs of schools around the world where there are X's marked on the floor and kids all separated from each other. So I'll throw the question to Sol. What should people start thinking about when they think about the physical redesign of a space, whether it's a very traditional space or whether it's like the Riverbend that we've just been hearing about, or Learn Life in Barcelona? What do you think should be the first thoughts for a school leadership to be thinking through as they think about coming back into a space?
I think that first of all, we have to realize that there's not a magical formula to this, but it's much more on challenge our creativity and imagination to solve as a community this issue, not only because of what are we going through, but also because it's a big opportunity to change the well-being in the learning community. So for me, one of the focus is we need to have a strong sense of community all together and work on that, not only like isolated teams, but all together. As an example, we are working on a protocol. As Steven, in Spain, for example, there's not a really, protocol that can be applied. Every week we have different instructions. So I think that it's much more important to somehow create our own criteria, that it's part of our team and community philosophy. And we're working on that, knowing, okay, this is what the law says, but this is what we think and feel is going to be the correct approach. For me, one thing is we need to have a friendly welcome, if you think in space. If I see the different examples around the world with this construction tape or isolation, or it looks like, 40 years ago when we were going to school with the typical old-fashioned table and chair where nobody was allowed even to close or hang out their hands. So I think we need to, more than ever, use our creativity. And I'm sure we can find a lot of things to apply that doesn't need to look like, when you see these images, for me, it's like the perception is fear instead of welcome and friendly. So I think we need to work completely different. The approach should be, okay, if we need to have physical distance, okay, why don't we look for a different approach? Biophilia design, for example. We can use different natural plants around the space to delimit, where you can go and work in different groups. So I'm sure we can find much more creative ideas to get an approach to this. And this doesn't mean also that we need to think about rethink all the spaces now and have a really huge budget to change everything. I don't think it's like this. I think it's just a huge and nice opportunity to change things for better. That's my opinion.
Okay, so Danish, we're heading towards the end of our time here now. So I'm going to throw a similar question to you about how does a school place a wellness agenda to become a pillar of the school's design, especially as they're thinking about coming back into full-time occupation again?
Well, I think COVID has given everyone this opportunity to slow down and think about, what are we doing here? You know, it's for us to go back to normal would actually be a mistake, right? So that shouldn't be our goal. We should see this as an opportunity to get better. I think, you know, at least here in the US, a couple of things that schools are realizing is all of our kids are different. I mean, we've been talking about different learning styles forever, but now they're realizing, you know, hey, not all of our kids are starting at the same baseline, right? They have different home conditions. They have different levels of tech savvy parents. Some have Wi-Fi at home, others don't. Some are trying to learn, you know, in their bedroom surrounded by, you know, 5 or 6 other siblings, and others have, you know, their parents' office available to them to take classes from, you know. So I think schools, it's been an abrupt wake-up call for them that, hey, our students are not all the same. So I think one of the key things is, when we do go back, is for schools to not forget that and realize that we need to be designing for all these different types of learners, but also different people with different home situations. And so I think, and different starting points, right? And so I think that actually contributes to wellness, because you are being equitable and realizing, you know, the support structures and the things that kids, which are, you know, people, what these students, these people, what they need to do well. And it's not just do well academically, but do well in their life, right? You could have brilliant kids who, quote unquote, don't make it because there were other factors outside of academics that get in the way, right? And so, you know, I think that's one thing. In terms of it becoming a pillar for a school, it's again, going back to this idea that, what are you here to do? Right? Are we here to just pass, you know, state and national exams? Is that what your goal is as an educator? Is that why you got into this? Is that, you know, what your legacy is going to be? Or do you want to produce the best people in the world, right? The happiest people, the most productive people, the people that give back and change society in the best ways possible. So, you know, I think just keeping that in mind and that your central focus, not, you know, well, we need to get them through these exams, we need to do this, we need, you know, we need to check these boxes. So I think it's, again, looking internally and saying, well, why am I spending, you know, 50, 60 hours a week, you know, as an adult in my professional life? Why am I working so hard on this, right? Going back to like why you got into it. And then from there, again, I think it's, if you realize what your end goal is, then it's just the design process is pretty straightforward from there, right? It's setting the target, which I think, or in this case, resetting that target that I think needs to happen for so many schools. And, you know, these images that you're both discussing that I've seen from around the world, you know, it's extremely dystopian, I'd say, and that's not a reality that anyone wants to go back into. And for the designers out there, I would say, well, that's why we exist, right? That is our job, to make sure that we can curate and design a more optimal experience and more pleasant and experience that people actually want to be in. You know, my fear is that schools will go back and, you know, I don't know about other countries, but in the US, we have facilities managers typically for schools that kind of handle everything from, you know, HVAC unit being broken to, you know, we need to expand the building. And you know, my fear is that they're just going to chart out this 6 foot by 6 foot grid and say, okay, educators, you have to operate within this grid. And fear will drive education as opposed, and the space, which will impact the education, as opposed to education impacting the space, and figuring out at the same time how to make it obviously healthy for everyone. But you know, a lot of these images, sold to your point, you know, in airports, we call it sort of security theater, right? When just going through the checkpoints, they're not super effective at actually catching things and stopping too much, but they give the public a sense of peace. It's theater, right? That's putting on for us. And so, you know, I suspect that a lot of the things we're starting to see in schools is also theater, just to calm the nerves, but let's figure out what really works, right? We're seeing the latest research that, you know, it's transmitted more through air than it is through surfaces. So maybe it's investing in HEPA filters for each classroom, right? Which is $1,000 each, right? So it's not necessarily we have to, you know, put everyone in a bubble, you know, in a 6-foot bubble all the time. And so again, let's look at the research. Let's look at the strategies that actually work. And by the way, as we're doing all of this, there's no point in just going back to education as normal. Let's use this to think about, well, why are we spending all of our time here, and why are we making kids stay here for 8-9 hours a day as well?
Okay, our time for this session is actually running out. You're available to be running a series of workshops in July for people who want to take the topics deeper. And I know that when we talked about that, you gave the title of designing for the things that are killing us in schools, killing people in schools, and the 3 topics were post-pandemic COVID design and curriculum and pedagogy. And I guess that appealed to me immediately because from an education perspective, I know that mental health issues have not been helped by people's approaches to curriculum and pedagogy. And so therefore, I guess that's a very interesting trio of topics which people can follow through if they want to, especially with an American time frame in July. If people want to follow the website and see that one. And for Sol, again, I know that there's quite a passion for demonstrating what's been happening at Learn Life, and for people who are in the European context that want to have conversations with you, that would be something that we can make available as well. So just for now, I want to thank you both for participating in this pre-recorded interview, and we look forward also to the live one coming up next week. Okay, that was great to hear from Danish and Sol. And Sol joins us now live from Barcelona. And Devin has also joined us. Devin is the leader of the sort of the learning team on the ground in Barcelona as well. Luca is with us for about another 10 minutes before he has to zip across to somewhere else in the world via Zoom and ultimately sleep going through. I think I know that Devin's been given some of the questions that have been asked on social media. I want to have a bit of fun before we get to those, first of all. And I'm going to ask Sol, if there was one thing that you absolutely hate in traditional school design, what would it be?
The typical classroom and sitting like soldiers. I should say we need to change completely our mindsets and start moving around. In fact, I'm again in a really kind of moving seat, as you see.
Yeah, so Sol was actually in the Learn Life space in Barcelona going through. Okay, perhaps the second part of that question, then, what's the one thing you've loved achieving in terms of the space as in Barcelona when we think about mental health and well-being?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
So when you think about what's been designed in Barcelona in the Learn Life space, what would be the one thing that you really you love about the space because of the way in which it impacts mental health and well-being?
I think that the challenge of, I already talked about this, of challenge ourselves to make a learning experience in every small corner of the space. It's one of the things that I really love about it. And so it's not only about creating nice, fancy, practical spaces, but how can we improve the friendly communication and well-being of our learners, to feel them that they are welcome, to be part of the community. An example is that we don't have any corridor, although this building is in the middle of Barcelona, in a typical Eixample area, full of corridors. We have the students can meet, chat, even we have spaces for lockers that are unlock lockers. So I should say that there's not a special place that I love more than other, but it's more like I feel really happy when I see our learning guys, so any user coming to the space that feels kind of the vibe of the space. And I think it's, again, not about creating nice spaces. You can find really nice design spaces all over the world. It's more like feeling this approach that there's a story behind every space that we design. And I think that's important.
Okay. Now, Luca, before you go, let's throw you that question. If there was one thing that you would like to remove from traditional education in order to improve mental health and well-being, what would it be?
I think, how do we go back to first principles? How do we ask better questions? And those questions might be, for example, not how do we stop kids from turning off their Zoom camera, but it might be a deeper question, a more provocative one, which is, how do we create an experience where our learner is so excited about that experience because we've given them agency, that they're driving it, that we are not just an instructor, we are a designer, an architect of learning that taps into the emotional centers of the brain, but also of our, into the identity of young people. That's kind of, I think, the big opportunity. What we're seeing is the collapse of standardized testing all over the world. We're seeing the collapse here in Australia of ATAR, Stephen, for many universities. So what we're seeing really is this unraveling of part of these, these kind of what success has meant in some spaces. So really, it's like, how do we be as bold as possible? Because I think there'll only be a few examples of people being too bold, and the rest of us probably will not be bold enough at really seizing this collective opportunity to reimagine and remake what the experience is in terms of the the design, the environment the learner's in, but also, the activity. And ultimately, how do we support? And I've always bang on about this, Stephen, the knowledge, the skills, and frankly, the character, the identity, how do we bring all that together so that people feel like they are safe, healthy, connected, more important than ever before, as part of their educational journey throughout life wide and lifelong. All
right. We're probably going to get time for one more question for you in a moment, which Devin might be able to throw your way in a moment.
Well, yes, indeed.
And we will continue on after you go. So Devin and I will go for another few minutes because we've got a little bit of time up our sleeve there. But Devin, is there a question that you can throw at
Oh, yes. I will shoot you a controversial question from Valerie Hannon, one of our thought leaders and the author of Thrive. We all love Valerie. She writes, is well-being the state to aim at? It's possible to enjoy well-being in circumstances that are intolerable and unsustainable for others and the natural world.
Oh, thanks, Valerie. Great to have you with us. My view on this, when we look at the articulation of policy, well-being should be an organizational value. It's not articulated in our professional standards, for example, here in Australia, but it's also, the idea that well-being should ensue. It's like we can't actually pursue happiness. We shouldn't aim to be happy because it's something that's ungraspable. But if we pursue meaning, then happiness can be a byproduct of us doing meaningful work. It's why I love the idea of how do we pursue meaningful work. Valerie, I've had this conversation before about, yes, resilience, but actually, when do we need revolution, and where is the kind of ultimately the balance with that? Because if we're all super resilient, we'll all be just cruising through COVID without any problems. Whereas really, how do we create, not just as a process of well-being, as an intertwined double helix, which is Dr. Jean Clinty talks about with well-being and learning, but actually how do we have it as kind of a destination? That's not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but I feel like there's something there that well-being is kind of, it's the ultimate outcome, that if we pursue too hard, we'll kind of lose sight of all the other elements, not least of all the planetary ones that we are working within.
Do you have time for another question, or do you have to go?
I can do one more.
Okay.
I have a few up my sleeve here. There's a question from Emma Buckle about how can we help remove the stigma surrounding topics of well-being and mental health? What strategies have worked for you?
I think we should just start with and this is Alain de Botton, who's a wonderful contemporary philosopher. He just says, we should just accept we're all going to need therapy. Why? Because we live in the modern world. The modern world is kind of filled with stresses. Our allostatic load, the amount of stress that we consume, the amount of news, the amount of negativity with our negativity bias. So largely, I think it's kind of practicing selective ignorance, which is kind of part of that. How do we ensure that we're not being overwhelmed by all the different challenges, but ultimately it's this idea of being integrated, and we've seen, I think Helen spoke to this beautifully in the recorded session that she shared tonight. How do we make it so normalized that it's seen as a healthy expression of our journey on this planet in our school, as opposed to, and stigma is everywhere, and there's some research, and I was speaking with a wonderful psychiatrist here in Australia that says, 85% of people in New Zealand, for example, they documented longitudinally had experienced some type of mental episode or illness across their lifetime. So that's practically everybody. So we take that as a given. I think that changes the conversation. And there's some wonderful work that's being done by all sorts of not-for-profits and organizations that really kind of help to pursue that agenda. But it should just be a normal conversation. We should start by asking the right questions, Devon. Things like, Devon, how do you feel? How are you? What's your emotional state? It's why I'm such an advocate for the social and the emotional skills as part of our education systems.
All right. Now, Luca, we're going to have to let you go because I know that you have to go to a number of other countries around the world via Zoom right now before you go to sleep tonight. I'll look forward to seeing you later on in the week as we connect again via Zoom. And thank you so much for your contribution tonight. I know that we're going to play the recordings of your two sessions in the second session tonight. So you become the recording and the others will become live. Thank you so much.
Well, I apologize in advance for people having to endure me, but it's been an absolute pleasure, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation and all the best to everyone with your collective work. It matters now and it matters more than ever. Oh.
See ya. All right, so Devon, you've got some other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We have Christina Smolensky asks of Soul, you have no budget or very little budget. What space improvements would you make or would you recommend to improve the learners and teachers' well-being?
I think that that's the idea, because almost with money we can do whatever. It's easy. So I think that most than ever we have to think in using our creativity. So, for example, why don't we just start thinking about unused spaces around school? That I will give an example of our own space. We have the typical space where you put all the garbage down the stairs. And we decided, why don't we create a nice space here? So we co-design with some students. We start as a starting point, making a research with the entire community to say, okay, what do you expect? What are you missing? What is the space that we need? And then when we collect all this data, it's told that they were looking for a solo space or space where they could work alone, like what we call it, the cave. And so we work with a really, really small budget, painting and putting some like nice furniture and creating a story behind that. I think that's how we involve the learners in being part of this design process and feel that the space, the school, in your case, it's part of your community. It's really important. We call it the yellow submarine. It's a really huge, small space, but I can tell you that almost all the learners, they are kind of fighting to be there. It's not about big budget. It's much more about creativity, making the learners be part of the design, and just talk to them, give word to them. As Helen said, they need to be here. We can't work alone as architects. We need to involve the entire community, the learning guys, the learners, and everybody.
So you and I have both shared how shocked we have been by some of the absurd propositions for what schools should look like. The one I think that we were both most appalled by was the one that has the panic space set up in the room, and you have to look forward and you can't breathe to your right or to your left. I'm curious for people who are the facilities managers or people managing the design and layout of these spaces. If you had a chance to meet with them, what would you say to them to try to help them see the light?
I don't know. Probably we need to have a deep conversation to understand their needs. One of our big challenge in our discipline is not to kind of convince them that what we are thinking is the best option. It's just to understand what is your need, what is your fear, what are you willing to do, what do you want to work, where do you feel friendly, and then knowing that we can provide the solution for that. So I think it needs first kind of deep conversation.
Now, Devin, we've got time for one more question now before we'll close off this session, because we'll be running again in a few hours' time. Is there a question that has been fed through to you that you think would be great to finish off with?
There has not been a space-related one, but I have one that is less from the school perspective, but from a lot of families are probably still dealing with some degree of remote working and having their children at home. What would you recommend as creatively changing the environment of the home to adapt to support the well-being of learners and their needs?
I think that if it's possible to create a friendly environment, and friendly can be depend on each person, as you said, for some people, be connected to a nice view means friendly environment. For others, being looking into a wall may make them feel more confidence. So I think that trying to hear themselves, to find the best corner of the house where they could feel comfortable working, and then like typical tips around don't spend too much time into the screen, trying to do some exercise, eating well, and all the things that we all know, but mainly related to the space. I think that we have to think about what it makes you feel comfortable when you are working, and take your time sitting in a proper chair, or having, I don't know, everything clean. I can talk about things, but I think it's more about hearing ourselves. How do we work better and create a nice environment at home to work? It's not good to work on our bed, for example, for sure. I'm not saying anything that anybody knows. And taking your pajama, it's better if you have clothes instead of pajama. It's going to feel like you are into a routine.
All right. Now, I know that in Australia, some people will start thinking about going to bed. In India, they'll be thinking about dinner. In Barcelona, they'll be thinking about lunch. In America, they're going to be thinking about getting up in time for our second session. So we're coming back at 2 a.m. Australian time. I'll be up. That will be 6 p.m. in Barcelona time. I think that makes it about 9:30 p.m. in India. It will make it 5 p.m. in London, makes it midday in central United States, and it makes it 9 a.m. in San Diego. So we're going to look forward to a live session with Danish and Sol, and also with Dr. Helen Griffith. And Devin will be back, I'll be back, and we thank everyone so much for listening, tuning in for this first session. If you're in Australia and you want to stay up for the second session, just make sure you tell me that via a tweet. I have to find some award for you as well, but we really appreciate the input, this is an incredibly important topic, and I guess the challenge and the opportunity ahead of us is to do something that is revolutionary in terms of how we think about school. There is the opportunity, as people have heard, to join Luca and myself in an Australian timeframe for a workshop series starting in July, in 2 weeks' time. We can help schools work through perhaps a vision for their wellness wellbeing program. There's an opportunity to be working also with Danish using the American timeframes, and also with Dr. Helen Griffith as well. So that those opportunities will be written up and be available on the learnlife.com website. So thank you, Devon. Thank you, Sol. And we look forward to seeing everyone